So in this interest rate swap contract, what are the key variables? What are the variables that you would expect to see? Well, we'd want to see, as in any of these contracts, we want to talk about the counterparties. There's got to be some discussion of a notional amount. So whatever is, if we're dealing with an interest rate swap, the interest rate has to be the interest rate times some dollar amount, some notional amount. We would want to see the start date, the maturity date, or the end date, the payment dates or frequency of payments. So if it's once a year, is it semi-annual, is it quarterly, is it monthly? We need to know that. We need to know what is the fixed rate and who's paying. We need to know the floating rate or the variable rate and who is paying. Okay? So we need to know all of it. We need to know the basis of the calculation. Is it 3360? Is it actual 360? Is it actual, etc.? That's the basis of the calculation. So you know when you calculate interest, it's the principal amount, in this case the notional amount, times the rate times the amount of time, and then the basis of the calculation. So we need to know the frequency, and then is the basis of calculation, if it's every quarter, is it based on the actual number of days that have gone on over 360, or is it just simply the number of months? So we're really just taking this and determining it's 1/12. So you have to know what your basis of your calculation is. Does the contract call for netting? And then on the floating rate, what is the market basis? What is the basis of the floating rate? So, for example, is it LIBOR, US Treasury? Those would be two market rates that we likely see. So these would be some of the key variables that you want to look for when you're looking at an interest rate swap. So let's go through our three criterion again. We should recall what those three criterion are. And we'll pull that up again here just to remind us. Right? We have to have an underlying in a notional amount or payment provision, little or no initial investment, net settlement, or the implicit ability to settle net in cash, right? So, what is the notional? Well, the notional is going to be spelled out in the contract here. We've identified that there has to be a notional amount in an interest rate swap contract. So, but what's the underlying? What is going to make this contract go up or down? Well, with an interest rate swap, it is going to be the market rate, the basis of the floating rate. That is going to be your underlying. right? This is what makes the contract go up. So if I'm paying floating and the floating rate goes up, that means I'm losing value. The fair value for me, if I'm paying more versus what I was prior to the rate going up, that means the fair value of this contract has moved away from me. If I'm paying floating and the floating rate goes down, that means I'm paying less money. Because if I'm paying the floating, that means I'm likely getting or receiving the fixed. Vice versa, if I am receiving floating and the floating rate goes down, that means I'm getting less money. That means the contract has moved away from me. If I'm receiving floating and the floating rate goes up, that means I'm getting more money and the fair value of the contract increases. So this is our underlying. And most of these contracts, whenever we set up an interest rate swap, we're usually putting the floating rate at whatever the market is currently. And so we can look at the floating and understanding what the fixed are. And it's likely that there is the very little money changing hands at inception of these contracts. But you have to look at the contract to see how much money changed hands. Most of the time, there is actually no initial net investment on either party. So that gets us through criterion 2. And most interest rate swaps, I would say the vast majority of them, call for settling your payments net. Instead of you give me a full fixed payment and I give you a full floating payment, we calculate what the difference is at that settlement date, and we're going to exchange the net cash payments on that date. So most swaps will call for net settlement. So an interest rate swap absolutely qualifies under the derivatives, under the derivative qualifications within ASC 815.1015-83.